morning from our global headquarters here in New York. I'm Manus Crenny. Welcome to Bloomberg Brief. Let's set that agenda. The bond bears are reawakened as the cash reopens. Stocks pause their gains while Bitcoin barrels towards $90,000. A Fed Speak Marathon Governor Waller set to kick off a host of remarks from Fed officials this week. And look out for the China hawks. President-elect Trump appoints Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Mike Waltz to his cabinet. Good morning. So there's a little bit of a shuffle higher in the bond yields. It's just causing a little bit of a pause for breath in equities. Mag 7 dipped a little bit yesterday. We're hearing more about the appointments to the cabinet, to the court of Trump. JP Morgan still say it's going to be a home run. You did 50 record highs. You didn't manage to put in the 51 yesterday. But JP Morgan say it's going to be a home run. Team USA, it's just going to be like the end of 2016. And just to give you some calibration for the end of 2016, the Russell went on to add 14% between Election Day and the end of the year. Roll it over and you'll see what I mean about the bonds. We're waiting for Waller, Barkin, Kashkari and Harker. We're also going to get the SLUs, the senior lending officers narrative. Now, yields are just popping more so at the short end relative to the long end. So, again, this is just very much a recalibration in the bond market. It just sort of hasn't reached a level to unseat the equity market rally, not by a long chalk. I want to show you Bitcoin because it's pretty magnificent. Up for the 6th day in a row. You're looking at this now, up 32% since the election day. We've come off our highs of the morning, and I'll talk to you more about what Cameron Winklevoss, the co-founder of Gemini, had to say a little bit later on. But right now, we're just coming off the highs, but it is a pretty exhausting run. So from Bitcoin, which is ground zero, let's say, for the Trump trade. Also, it is the dollar. Just look at the 5 days on G10 currencies, and you will see the pain that was felt in the euro and some of the other Nordic currencies. This is WCRS. You can see that ground zero for the pain was the krona and the euro, down 2.76% over the past 5 days. So the dollar is in its ascendance. And with that in mind, SocGen's Kit Juckes, our next guest, says this. As long as a stronger U.S. growth and higher U.S. rates and the world's confidence in the dollar's status are intact, the dollar will remain very highly valued. But we doubt it can get much more highly valued than it is already. I'm pleased to say Kit Juckes joins us now, Chief FX Strategist over at SocGen. Kit, which brings me to the point, which is this already at peak dollar? Or are we nearing that without knowing the details of what Trump Mark II will be?
I think I'll side with JP Morgan and say peak dollar is probably at Christmas, for want of a better day. In other words, we're going there fast now. If the bond market goes into a fourth quarter rise in yields, if the whole debate about tariffs continues, then we're going to push this pretty hard between now and Christmas, but I think we're more or less done then. The starting point, remember, is that the dollar in real terms is higher than it's been at any point since the 1980s. So it's a very big dollar. But the other side of that is in 1985, it went miles higher than this, sort of 84, 85, until President Reagan sends his Treasury Secretary, Jim Baker, off to Paris to say, well, we'd like to get everybody behind us to intervene. We'd like to have a meeting sometime, which turned into the Plaza Accord, and we're going to change our stance on fiscal policy. Donald Trump's not going to do that anytime soon. So we've got more to go. These things can overshoot. I don't think we'll beat the highs that we saw in 2022 in euro-dollar. I doubt we'll make a new high in dollar-yen. But right now, we are definitely going to go up a little bit further.
So if he's not going to go for a recalibration as in the Paris Accord, as in sending Baker to Paris, but he is potentially going to send Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz out on the road. Your first take on those appointments?
Well, we'll see. I mean, they look like Team Trump people, so that they're going to be in line with the message that he wants. So we're going to have a conversation about trade. Certainly, and a conversation about what the US wants from its partners around the world, and it's likely to be, quite a difficult conversation for other people, and I think everyone's recognizing that. So the big conversation is the one they're going to have with China, obviously.
Obviously. Can I just test why you think we're going to hit this peak dollar narrative around Christmas time? What is it? Is it that we travel and arrive? Once we see the potential for tariffs, we begin to breathe a sigh of relief. We know the knowns.
Yeah, there's a lot of already in the price from where we are now. Remember, the dollar's been going up for a bit. It's been very strong for a very long time. We understand US economic exceptionalism. We understand that US interest rates are higher than elsewhere. The carry trade is back on in earnest in Japan. But the foreign exchange market isn't the equity market. It's not the Bitcoin market. It's founded at some point in a sense of where your long-term value is. So you know that in the longer run, real exchange rates do mean revert to a significant degree. The dollar is at very high levels, accelerating higher, and the big acceleration brings the peak closer.
Okay, closer and faster. Therefore, is the demise of the euro closer and faster perhaps than we think? Political chaos, a cutting cycle, tariffs. And as you say in your words, Europe has a problem. It's called Germany.
Yeah, I mean, the European economy is not functioning. But what Germany is two things at the same time. One, it's an economy trying to find its way now that it can no longer rely on very cheap energy supplies. And secondly, trying to work out what to do with its money. Germany has replaced Japan as the world's biggest exporter of capital, of savings. So they have the biggest net investment surplus in the world now. That sort of, it means they've got an enormous amount of money that's flowed out, but we've seen what happened to Japan. The yen weakened a long way after that. What they need is to get some of their savings invested at home, making things, doing things, green or otherwise, that get the economy moving. And the sooner they just grasp that nettle, the sooner the euro will stop being under pressure.
And that's a political nettle, isn't it, for 2025 in terms of going to the polls?
Exactly. We need Europe to recognise its growth deficit, to recognise the things it needs to do, and possibly to recognise that it needs to create conditions for more investment to happen at home, rather than just wash around looking for higher yields on the other side of the Atlantic.
We mentioned China. I'm going to spend a bit of time in the next section talking to one of our colleagues in China in terms of the response, the fiscal response that we are seeing. But Kit, to what extent, given that you've seen these cycles before, do the Chinese front run the most extreme policy response from the United States of America? And what tolerance do they have for a weaker yen? What's an acceptable weaker yuan, excuse me? What is an acceptable weaker yuan that is not attacked aggressively by the international FX markets? What's a controlled depreciation for yuan?
Well, I think a quick depreciation is almost better than attempting at controlling slow slippage. I mean, the problem that they have is that once it seems to the rest of the world that if you have a big increase in tariffs, that the response last time was to just let the currency weaken to offset that. If people think that's going to happen, you have to have watertight capital controls to stop yuan leaving the country and the currency weakening slowly, steadily on the back of capital flight. So there is an argument for saying that you should go now and make a big step where, then say we're not letting any more happen. The other side of that is that the Chinese administration has never shown any inclination to use the currency as a policy tool in any make, shape or form. So they would rather the problem just went away. So we'll have to see how Beijing feels about this. But the danger is that the Chinese people get ahead of this and start getting out of yuan before the inevitable devaluation happens, if that's what the policymakers feel pushed to.
Listen, let's just close off with here in the United States of America. We spend a lot of time pre-election and post-election talking about tariffs, 20%, 30%, 60%. However, perhaps less aggressively spoken about is the deportation. We're beginning to see who's going to be in charge of that regime. That is a structural supply-side risk in the United States of America.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that the US is going to face, others do at the same time, is that if you're running your economy very strongly, if you're creating strong employment growth, and if you're then saying, I want to bring manufacturing jobs home, but your unemployment's 4.1% today, 4.1% is very low by historical standards. It can get lower than this. But if you don't get the kind of labor force growth that the States has had in the last year or two, it gets really difficult. You'll get more upward pressure on wages. And then President Trump will have to be careful because it would seem that, to a significant degree, that the last two elections I've watched, inflation cost the Prime Minister and President his job.
It did indeed. Kit Juckes, thank you very much. Laying the table this morning on the FX plane. That is Kit Juckes of SocGen. Other stories trending on your Bloomberg terminal. This is what we got for you. Nissan shares jumping the most in 15 years after an activist investor took a 2.5% stake in the automaker. The investor is believed to be managed by Effissimo Capital Management and is fueling speculation that the company may undergo structural reforms. SoftBank swung to the biggest quarterly profit in 2 years on a series of successful Indian listings. Its plans to shift its focus towards generative AI, with the recent bets including OpenAI and Perplexity AI. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Social Democrats and the opposition lawmakers have reached an agreement to hold an early federal election on February 23rd. That's according to government officials familiar with the talks. Scholz will need to trigger the national ballot by first submitting a confidence vote that will likely come in December. Coming up, China hawks and Israel allies. President-elect Donald Trump continues to fill the cabinet. More on the story. And we'll unpack the moves and how they're reacting in the bond market with Kathy Jones from Charles Schwab later this hour. Context matters on Bloomberg. It's Bloomberg Brief. I'm Manus Cranny here in New York. More appointments coming in hard and fast from President-elect Donald Trump. He's expected to tap Senator Marco Rubio as Secretary of State and Congressman Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. CNN also reporting that Kristi Noem has been picked for Homeland Security. Let's get a little bit more. Mike Shepard joins us now from Washington. Mike, an early start for the day for you. We've got names to frame up and understand a little bit more. Just put some framing around Rubio and Congressman Waltz. I love the line from Politico this morning. That's the sound of a tiny sigh of relief when it comes to Marco Rubio. Is that how we should be approaching a Rubio appointment?
Well, in some ways, because it brings a level of depth and experience to a position that some had wondered which direction will Trump go? Marco Rubio is, as you noted, an avowed China hawk. He is somebody who has been seeking to get tough on Beijing, but he has also been someone who has stood by Taiwan and supported funding the U.S. umbrella of defense for the self-governed island. And this is a bit of reassurance to all the industries that the U.S. depends on in Taiwan as well. Donald Trump, of course, had sent some signals that maybe he wasn't as down with all of that defense for Taiwan, similar to his reservations about Ukraine as well.
It's ironic, isn't it, is that Rubio was actually sanctioned by the Chinese. Just give me a little bit of flesh on the bone with Mike Waltz. He's National Security Advisor, and again, he has military credentials.
Yes, he does. He was a Green Beret who served 4 tours in Afghanistan, combat experience, but he has also been a reliable surrogate for Donald Trump in the House of Representatives. He is somebody who has gotten to know Trump, and I think that's really one of the common threads in all of the people he has picked so far. They're familiar to him and they are loyal to him. And that is going to help Donald Trump avoid some of the tumult that we saw, especially at the beginning of his first administration, when we saw all of these well-known people, including former ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson, come into high-profile jobs and then quickly fall out with Donald Trump simply because they weren't on the same page with him, policy or otherwise, and didn't understand how he works. So Mike Waltz will come in, as will Marco Rubio and Kristi Noem and others, understanding how the boss, to put it another way, will run his White House and how they can work with him to support his and their own policy agendas. Mike Waltz is somebody else who has been skeptical of Ukraine funding, like Donald Trump, mainly because he wants the U.S. to focus more on some of its problems at home, including the question about the border, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see where they come together on the issues of NATO, for example. And he did, of course, spend time in the George W. Bush administration. So that's the China hawk ascendance, what one can say. Can we just talk about the potential pressure then on Iran? If these are hawkish names on the China side, can we expect more pressure on Iran and a more pro-Israel stance that might shape up in the geopolitical stage?
Well, this is certainly something we have heard from both Senator Rubio and Congressman Waltz, that they felt the Biden administration in some ways was handcuffing Benjamin Netanyahu in seeking to go after Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. Hamas and Hezbollah are two organizations that are supported by Iran. They're designated as terror groups by the U.S. and a number of other countries. And they feel that the Biden team could have done more to back Israel, even though the U.S. under Biden, to be fair, has provided the Israeli government with a huge flow of arms and other support in its defense and in its efforts to go after those groups. But they would like to see more, and they would like to see more direct action and more pressure put on the regime in Tehran.
Shep, thank you so much. That's Michael Shepard in Washington with the latest appointments to the cabinet of Donald Trump, president-elect. Let's look at this from the China perspective. We have our senior Chinese economy and government reporter, James Mega, who joins me now. James, just obviously describing the individuals that have been chosen. I mean, what guide do president-elects, do these appointments give us in terms of the China policy?
I think with regards to policy towards China, especially on tariffs, we're going to really have to wait for the economic appointments as well to become clear. If it's Robert Lighthizer as the U.S. Treasury Secretary, or that's looking less likely now, though he apparently did want that job, or if he comes back as USTR, that's going to be that's going to put a lot more pressure on China, because you have the economic side of the relationship trying to decouple from China very strongly. You also have the diplomatic and military side of the relationship putting being very hawkish on China. If you have people who are coming in who are much more concerned about what happens with markets and how that how putting 60% tariffs immediately on all goods from China will affect financial markets and trade flows. A lot much less hawkish U.S. Treasury Secretary, for example, or USTR would sort of provide a break on some of the more extreme policies that Trump floated on the campaign trail. So we're going to really need to see sort of both sides of that arrangement. But I think what China's looking at, the appointments that have come out so far, they're seeing a confirmation that the U.S. is looking to contain their rise. The U.S. is looking to contain the Chinese economy, and the U.S. is looking to stop how China frames it, they're looking to stop the development of China, which they see as their right. So I think whoever is appointed, in the end, they will see a confirmation of their worst fears about what U.S. policy towards them is and what Donald Trump's policy towards them is. But the devil will be in the details.
Absolutely. Just had a conversation with Kit Juckes, and he said, look, if you're going to weaponize the yuan, which he doesn't think that the Chinese is their current base case. He said, if you're going to do it, make it short, sharp, and fast. But how does China counteract the risk of that max out 60% tariff? We saw some fiscal moves overnight. You and I talked yesterday about excesses in China. So where's the pathway beginning to look a little bit clearer here?
I think on the domestic front, if trade with the U.S. ends, or exports to the U.S. end in some sense, U.S. exports are about 3% of Chinese GDP. So China has to find a place where those goods can be sold, whether that's domestically or whether it's foreign. They have to be exported somewhere else, and that will lead to a reaction from other countries who don't want those goods being dumped in their markets. So if the Trump administration comes in and immediately starts raising tariffs to very high levels, China is going to have to do a lot more to stimulate demand. Just to absorb all the goods that are currently going to America. But again, I think you get an administration that comes in and is promising all these things that are diametrically opposed. You can't expel millions of workers and at the same time raise tariffs. It just will lead to massive inflation domestically.
James, thank you very much. James Mega there on the very latest from China. More on Bloomberg Brief in just a moment. Good morning from New York. Front pages from around the world. This is what we got for you. Other headlines making the news. First up, kicking off with the Washington Post, leading with the Democrat Ruben Gallego beating Republican Kari Lake in the Arizona Senate race. That's the last Senate race to be called, giving the Republicans 53. Gallego will succeed retiring Senator Kirsten Sinema. Next up, New York Times. Donald Trump Jr. is joining 1789 Capital. It's a venture capital firm. It invests in conservative-leaning companies. He won't be joining his father's administration in an official role. Trump Jr. has spent most of his professional career working for the Trump organization. And I take you to a thing of splendor. It depends whether you're on the winning side of this trade or not. There's Bitcoin. Now, it almost made it to $90,000 this morning. Turnover is at a record at BlackRock. But I want to show you Cameron Winklevoss's tweet this morning, co-founder of Gemini. I mean, they're full. They contributed to Donald Trump's campaign, etc. Now, you've got to actually go to X and listen to this. This is the Phil Collins song, but it's brilliant. Bitcoin is becoming unburdened by what it has been. Now, just watch this. Look at the Bitcoins fly. You got to love it. They donated $1 million in Bitcoin to the at-real Donald Trump. That caught my eye this morning. A little bit of levity as we go to a short pause. From our global headquarters here in New York, you're welcome to Bloomberg Brief. I'm Manish Cranny. Let's set your agenda. The bond bears are reawakened as the cash reopens. Stocks pause their gains while Bitcoin barrels towards $90,000. A Fed speak marathon. Governor Waller set to kick off a host of remarks from Fed officials this week. And look out, the China hawks are in ascendance. President-elect Trump appoints Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Mike Waltz to his cabinet. Good morning. Stocks are moderately irked, down 0.25%. They didn't quite strike out yesterday. We're just pausing here. The Mag 7 dipped yesterday, Nvidia and Apple. But JP Morgan still say, look, this is going to be a home run. Team USA will take it home. Take your mind back to 2016. And 2016, by the way, the Russell went up by 14% by Christmas. This was a powerful rally in the first Trump era. And Evercore say, this bull market is still in its infancy. So pause for breath. Why is it pausing? Let me show you day one after Veterans Day. The futures prices were down yesterday. Yields were rising quite considerably in the equivalents. But look at the short end of the curve, up by 5 basis points this morning. We wait for the CPI data tomorrow. There's an uncomfortable truth about what 3.3% on core CPI might really mean for the Fed. But the front end is locking and loading higher this morning by 5 basis points. Let's ask somebody who's been through a few cycles of politics and markets. It is Kathy Jones, Chief Fixed Income Strategist at Charles Schwab. Good morning.
Good morning.
So I wouldn't say the bond bears are viciously reawakened, but certainly we've come back from Veterans Day with a new mission, which is higher yields. So that's the first blush. This is an uneasy bond market, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We have the components of higher inflation on the horizon with tariffs, with potential fiscal stimulus, possibly more tax cuts. And, this general kind of isolationism that could cause us. An immigration reform could mean labor costs begin to rise. So we have components on the horizon that are offsetting the prospect of Fed rate cuts.
Look, we don't know the timing of the tariffs. We don't know the size of the tariffs. But something that has gone through my mind is that it's a much bigger structural issue if this next administration goes very aggressively, as they have promised, on deportation and immigration. That, Kathy, is perhaps the bigger and longer lasting inflationary pulse.
It is, because as the baby boomers retire out in the U.S. of the workforce, we've seen over the last couple of years since COVID ended that the replacements for those workers have been largely immigrants. And so we don't have the components of a rising workforce if we just stay with native-born Americans. So immigration's been an important part of lifting the economy and overall employment and mitigating some of the wage gains that could drive inflation. So that could have a very long-term structural impact on the potential growth rate in the economy.
Look, we're trading in a range at the moment for, 447, 450 on the upside, 425 on the downside. When you begin to see the complexion of tariff from this next administration, is that when you begin to reprice towards 5%, or does this market not hang around and it takes us there in preemption?
I think it gets there preemptively if we don't get any signs that things are going a different direction. So if you assume, as the market is now assuming, that the terminal rate is 3.75% to 4%,
yes,
you add 100 to 150 basis points to that as a kind of 10-year yield average or median over the years. So let's roughly just add 100 basis points. Well, you're pretty much at 5% right there. And I think the market's going to price that in unless we see dramatically.
So 5% would actually be a moderately fair value, all things kind of being equal, if you're working on the basis that you have that higher terminal rate. It's not that it's an extreme move. So could we see a more extreme move than above 5%? What is it that could take you above that parapet?
We'd have to see higher inflation numbers than we're expecting. So we are still looking for inflation to drift down, as it has, but it's kind of stabilized in this 2 to 2.5 area. It can't really push lower until that happens towards 2%. We can't have confidence that it's really going to get to target. And that means the Fed can't let up too much, and then we get the 5% fair value.
But then that takes us to Kashkari's comment, which it's not all the way home. This is about inflation. I mean, home is just getting further and further and further away. For the average bond market observer, if you're an equity person, home is getting further away. We're going to hear from Waller, we're going to hear from Barkin, Kashkari and Harker today. How tempered will their language be about the home run to 2%?
I think they'll be very cautious as the data have come in stronger than expected since last September. They have to temper their expectations there, and then, of course, with the potential inflation on the horizon and maybe a stabilizing inflation right now, right around 2.5-ish, they have to be cautious about the forward guidance. And there is no real forward guidance yet, and that's what we're all waiting for.
So if I look at the bond market action post the election, we actually had this flattening of the curve into the close of business last week. That will change this morning. There'll be a small tick higher on that. When you look at the market, you want to avoid duration but play a steepener.
Yeah, we like kind of benchmark duration or lower right now.
Okay.
So we had been benchmarked maybe a little higher. Now we're lower because we're thinking that you can't really get short rates down very much from here, and long rates have room to move up if we have more inflation. So I do think you want to play a steepener, but also try to keep your duration relatively on the low end of the range.
The tariff discussion that we have often leaves out blowback, boomerang. You choose your phrase, and that is the much higher risk, isn't it? It's not just what you lay out or what you give out, but it is what the counteraction is to you, and that's where you say it can add to a much more enduring inflation shock.
Yeah. So the tariff gives us a one-time price increase on imports, but then if we get retaliatory tariffs, which would be expected.
Yeah.
Most of the time when we do this, we get retaliatory tariffs. And then you get an economic slowdown, and you lose investment in the U.S. and you lose growth in the U.S. So it gets to be a very negative kind of cycle that plays out. So you get somewhat slower growth and higher inflation. That's not a great picture.
So Steve Raschuta was in that seat last week, and he chastised me that there weren't many bond vigilantes left, and yet then I hear Nouriel Roubini, who often, of course, refers to the bond vigilantes. But what is it, if we start with the thesis that you've just given me, which is minus 5%, actually is pretty much fair value for bonds is where they should be if you go on the terminal rate. But if you move into this trade war, tariff world, tax cutting scenario, what is the number in the bond market that flashes really, really amber to red for the rest of risk?
Oh, boy. That's a tough question.
It is a tough one, but we're going to have to grapple with it.
Yeah. At some point, the market demands a higher and higher risk premium.
Yep.
In order to fund our deficits, in order to compensate for inflation. So what is that? Historically, the upper end of that might, if we have a terminal rate of 3.75% to 4%, it might be as high as 5.5%. We'll have to get to a point where the market really, really pushes back on auctions, or really, really pushes back on data or comments from the Fed. If the Fed were to cut and the market didn't like the fact that they were cutting in what they see as a potentially inflationary era, that you could see long rates move up.
Well, look, either way, this next administration is going to have to issue more debt. How much of a conversation are people in the market really having about bond market indigestion? Do they run models of what happened to Liz Truss?
Yeah, they look at Liz Truss.
They look at Liz Truss and they pray, do they?
They look at that experience. I do think the U.S. is in a better position than the U.K. to deal with that. And we're not looking for some sort of catastrophe in the bond market. But incrementally, they demand more yield, right? More, and especially if there's nothing on the horizon to kind of curb that or to deter that rise in the debt.
So you think a bit more term premium to come?
Could be.
Okay. Kathy, thank you very much. Great conversation. Good to see you. Getting up early, keeping the lights on for us here. Kathy Jones there of Charles Schwab. Coming up on the show, President-elect Donald Trump set to appoint China hawks to the cabinet. Who are they and what does it mean for policy? We'll run you through it right here on Bloomberg Brief. It is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Menace Crenny in New York. More cabinet picks coming in from President-elect Donald Trump. He's expected to appoint Republican Senator Marco Rubio and Secretary of State, I should say, and Republican Congressman Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, both from Florida. CNN also saying that Kristi Noem has been picked as Homeland Security. Let's get Michael Shepard's opinion on the individuals and what we know about them from Washington. Mike, good to see you. So Senator Rubio, Congressman Waltz, one could say China hawks in the ascendant. These are pretty punchy picks.
They sure are. And they are also joined by Elise Stefanik, another congresswoman. She's from New York. She is another Trump loyalist who has also made her mark by being very tough on China. She is another part of this growing caucus of China hawks in both parties here in Washington. And we can expect the three of them to work with Trump to carry out this policy of a tough posture against the world's second largest economy. And that includes the tariffs that we've been talking about so much on this show and so many other venues across all of our Bloomberg platforms, but in other ways too. And we can look for the U.S. to try to fortify its military in different ways to prepare for, the remote prospect of some sort of confrontation, with Beijing in some fashion. And the heightened rhetoric, it is certainly something that the U.S. is leveling against China. And China is very aware of this now at this moment. They're seeing the Rubio and Waltz and Stefanik picks in a lot of ways as a worst case scenario for them if they were hoping to ease tensions with the U.S. at any point in the near future.
That's interesting. I was just looking at something that Politico wrote when it came to Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. They said that sound that you hear is a tiny sigh of relief because we've yet to understand where Lighthizer may well appear. Look, we're dealing with them as China hawks, but this has got implications. Trump is leaning into the Senate and leaning into Congress to take people for the administration. This is going to present other issues in terms of leadership battles on Capitol Hill.
It sure will. And in fact, in the House, we still don't have an outcome in terms of which party will control the chamber. And that will pose a challenge for whoever ends up being the House Speaker if it stays in Republican hands. We saw over the past year just how difficult it was for Speaker Mike Johnson to maintain control with a very narrow margin. He's already taking two key Republican lawmakers out of the House. And if the margin is still in Republican favor, but much narrower, Mike Johnson will have very few votes that he can afford to lose if he is reelected Speaker early next year. So this has some implications for whether Trump can advance his agenda through Congress in the early part of the year before special elections are held to fill those seats that are being vacated by Elise Stefanik and by Mike Waltz.
So it's a high wire act, really, into this first 100 days as well. There are consequences with these picks in terms of the prism of Iran and Israel, and they are being shaped and being presented as being very pro-Israel and much more pressure to come on Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can expect from those three foreign policy picks a very muscular posture toward Iran and very, very much pro-Israel as well as it continues to prosecute its military actions against Hamas and Hezbollah, two groups that have been designated as terror organizations by the U.S. and other nations. Another area that's important to note is that these three picks have all expressed skepticism about continued funding and support for Ukraine's war effort against Russia and a desire to perhaps seek a quick settlement, as Donald Trump has pushed for. So we'll want to see how they carry out that policy and how quickly they can actually bring that to bear. Remember, it's only a week since the election. Trump is already forming this cabinet, but they won't take office until January, and then they will still need to be confirmed. We can expect the confirmation process to go quickly with the Senate now in Republican hands, but it will still take time for them to get up to speed and get moving on some of these key issues, including Ukraine as well as the Middle East.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. Great up, some Mike Shepard there in Washington on Trump's picks for cabinet. UBS European Conference is in full swing in London. The Finnish Central Bank President Olli Rehn told Bloomberg what he made of the outcome of the US election.
As far as the tariffs are concerned, it's too early to tell what are the specifics of US trade policy of the incoming administration. We know that there will be tariffs in the verbal pipeline spoken of, but we don't know exactly what kind of, and of course, Europe will not be caught off guard this time like last time. Europe will have to give its response, and then we will see whether there is some kind of a negotiating process. The last thing we need now, with the geopolitics in very tense situation, war in Ukraine, Russia's illegal war, Middle East burning, the last thing we need now is yet another trade war, especially between allies.
But, Governor, could you see the trajectory of monetary policy changing because of these tariffs? Would there be, for example, less focus on services inflation? That's been one of the big worries of the central bank.
It's service inflation is a concern that's related to wage growth, and wage growth has moderated, although it's still somewhat elevated. Concerning the timeline of the effect of US tariffs, that's going to be medium to long term, and we can only react in monetary policy to economic and developments we know and we see and we feel, and then we react on the basis of our price stability mandate, looking at how best achieve our symmetric inflation target of 2% over the medium term.
Will that be easier to achieve?
Well, in my view, geoeconomic fragmentation and higher tariffs, protectionism is by definition inflationary. It would be probably more inflationary in the United States, combined with expansionary fiscal policy supported by tax breaks. But it would have a detrimental effect of the whole world economy, including Europe.
Finnish Central Bank President Olli Rehn speaking to Bloomberg. More breaking news coming from Germany on the process for confidence votes being called. Scholz will seek a confidence vote on December the 16th, and then that will set the stage for an election, probably on February the 23rd. The red headline from a little bit earlier on was that German lawmakers agree to hold a federal election on February the 23rd. So the confidence vote is on the 16th. That is the latest news from Germany. Well, the latest read on the consumer before the CPI reading comes in. It is Home Depot. That will be before the bell this morning. Dasha Avasanavia joins me now. So, Dasha, this is inextricably linked, Home Depot, to an interest rate play. But how's the stock doing? How are the consumers doing at Home Depot?
Well, the stock has had an amazing few months and has actually performed really well, which is surprising given that analysts expect sales in same stores to fall 3% and also in the quarter. So the business is kind of contracting because of interest rates have been high and people are buying homes less and they're renovating their homes less, but the stock has somehow been growing. Probably on expectations that interest rates will be cut, and again, of course, in recent days on the general sort of Trump positivity. So as you mentioned, the interest rates have this kind of amplified effect compared to other consumer goods companies, because it's about, are people remortgaging and then renovating their homes? Are they buying new homes? And on top of that, the company's recently increased its debt burden to 2.6 times EBITDA through its acquisition of SRS Distribution, a trade distributor company, and the company's planning to reduce that debt burden back to around 2. So I expect the markets and analysts will be looking for updates on how it's doing that too.
Look, it's had a nice run into this set of numbers, one can say. Can that endure? That's going to come down to the outlook. And also, you and I were chatting about it. It's about the debt profile of this company and whether that can be materially lowered.
Exactly. And it's about, like with all the consumer goods companies, it's about how well is this company managing its a very difficult environment, very sort of stingy consumers that are delaying spending, and how are they operationally managing the bad times in anticipation for the better times when interest rates eventually ease off.
Okay, Dasha, thank you very much. Let's see what the numbers are as we go through the morning. Dasha Afanasieva there on Home Depot. One of the Trump trades personified, it's on fire. It's given a little bit back this morning. It's Bitcoin. We were barreling towards that 90,000 level, and it just shows you the scale of the volatility. We've come all the way back, but it's been romping home over the past 6 days. Digital assets worldwide are now worth more than $3 trillion. My favorite line is from Chris Weston this morning. It's in beast mode. And Cameron Winklevoss, the co-founder of Gemini, says Bitcoin is becoming unburdened by what has been. So right now it's giving a little bit back, but you've got to say this has been a pretty mighty run since the election, up just over 30% now, giving a little bit back. Its peak rally was up 32% since the election. Coming up, it's a huge day for Fed speak. We'll run you through who's on the docket and also the earnings that matter right here on Bloomberg Brief. Bloomberg Brief, I'm Manus Cranny here in New York. Your day ahead looks a little bit like this. Fed speak galore. You've got Governor Waller, Presidents Barkin, Kashkari and Harker all making their remarks throughout the day. Will they talk about the target of 2%? Then you've got the Senior Loan Officer Opinion Survey on bank lending practices. That hits the tape at 2 p.m. Plus, we've just been talking about Home Depot reports before the bell and Occidental Petroleum after the bell. Some stocks for you to keep your eye across. Grab, the shares jump from the Asia ride-hailing company, raising its earnings forecast. Live Nation gains as the concert organizer adjusted its operating income beats on the current estimates. And MicroStrategy, well, the crypto-linked stocks, they are having a little bit of a turn lower as Bitcoin comes off that 89,000, nearly at 90,000 level. I'm going to leave you with a quick snapshot of what's going on in the bond markets, because this is where you're just seeing a reawakening post-Veterans Day. Yields are rising. We're counting down to that Fed speak. And then we've got the discomfort of CPI tomorrow. But certainly what you are seeing is a reappraisal of the risks as we know a little bit more about the appointments of Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz to the Trump cabinet. That's it for Bloomberg Brief. Bloomberg Surveillance is up next. They'll take you through the rest of the markets right here on Bloomberg.